Hello?
Okay, hi everyone. This is Dan Barry. Welcome to the December MAPP webinar. Today we have 5 speakers who are going to talk to us about model development and analysis. These are projects that are funded by the Modeling, Analysis, Predictions, and Projections program. We're going to hear first from Joao Teixeira of JPL, Mending Zhang from University of Maryland, Tom Hamill from NOAA Israel, Melissa Bukovsky from NCAR, and then Xiaoqing Zhang from NOAA GFDL. The format of the webinar today, we're going to have these 5 talks, and I'll include some time after each talk for 1 or 2 questions. And then hopefully at the end of the webinar, we'll have a little bit of extra time for discussion. The webinar should run until about 2:30 today, give or take 10 minutes. So thanks everyone for joining. And Joao, are you on the line?
I'm on the line.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is switch control over to your computer now.
Do I need to do any of the other things? No. Quick start and all that?
Not yet. Well, now you should do quick start and then share my desktop and then go to your slides and then take it away.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Can everyone hear me? I'm on a cell phone, unfortunately. I couldn't get my office phone to work.
Yeah, it sounds good. It sounds good, Joao.
All right. So let me start by, so the title is about turbulence and convection parameterizations, mostly in the boundary layer, and about a method that we've developed, a bunch of us, Eddy-Diffusivity Mass-Flux, that combines both diffusivity and Mass-Flux concepts. A lot of this work has been done in the last 10 years by many people. In particular, the last 2 years, and with respect to the NOAA project, is mostly me, Chris Bratterton, Marcin Vitek, Kai Suche, and Ryu Sun. And let me go to the second slide. This is a very brief summary of what most of you know, that our great problem in terms of weather and climate models is that our equations are based on the fundamental laws of physics, but they're complex and coupled, and so we can't really find analytic solutions, and we don't even, are not even able to prove that there are analytic solutions. But it's kind of ironic in a way, because weather prediction is actually quite good in many respects. So what we do is that we discretize them and solve algebraic expressions for each box in the world, and because we have to be global, our boxes are quite large. So for climate models, the typical box would be 100 by 100 kilometers, but you just need to go outside and realize that clouds are not 100 by 100 kilometer boxes. There's a lot of structure in the small scales, as you can see here. So what I show here is actually a depiction of a convective cloud structure from a high-resolution model that I'll discuss in the next slide. And if the small scales didn't have a big influence on the large scales, we will be fine, but they do, and then because the system is nonlinear, so we really need to find ways of representing the statistics, in a way, of the small scales. And in practice, what we have to develop is equations for the dynamics of those statistical moments. On the right side, so I can actually go with my mouse here, right? So here is one example that I'm not going to talk about, but it has to do with cloud parameterization. So what I did is to plot, this is the amount of water. This is actually total water, so vapor plus liquid, and this is liquid water potential temperature, but think of it as a temperature, don't worry too much. And the white line is the Clausius-Clapeyron saturation curve. And what I have here is a histogram of all the points of, let's say, a 2-dimensional slice across this domain of 100 by 100 kilometers through a variety of points, probably about 1 million points in the high-resolution model. And if you plot this, you get a PDF or a histogram, and you realize that some points are above the saturation line, some are below. And for example, to calculate values like cloud fraction or liquid water, you would only, and only is not the right word, but you would only need to know what the sort of the shape of the distribution is to actually estimate that all the points that are sort of north of the saturation line are inside the cloud, and all the others are outside the cloud. So you can calculate a bunch of stuff. But the essential part of this part of the slide is actually to show that what you need to do is to come up with a knowledge about the distributions of these different variables, and in particular, and this is the equation below, the fundamental term in terms of turbulence and convection parameterization in weather and climate prediction models, in ocean models as well, is to determine this covariance between the vertical velocity W and any other variable. And you obtain this general equation from Reynolds decomposition and averaging, and you get sort of an Eulerian tendency for the mean and advective tendency for the mean, and then this sort of vertical divergence of the subgrid scale flux. So finding out what equations can represent realistic the subgrid scale flux is really the main quest of the convection and turbulence parameterization. So I go to the next slide, and here is just to highlight that one of the most fundamental tools we have used in the last 10 to 15 years is what we call large eddy simulation models. And these models are models that also solve the Navier-Stokes equations, but in much higher resolution, about 10-meter resolution, but in, of course, smaller domains, as you can see here. The domains here are about, they're pretty large, except for LES, which is 80 kilometers by 80 kilometers. But the fundamental point being that most convection in the boundary layer and probably most of the turbulence in the boundary layer is really happening at scales bigger than 10 meters. If you have a model that resolves everything larger than 10 meters, then this is a very good thing, of course. The other part is that you still need closures. You still need to parameterize what happens at smaller scales than 10 meters. But the problem is simpler than the one of trying to close weather and climate prediction models. Whatever happens at scales smaller than 10 meters is usually simpler to represent than whatever happens at scales smaller than, let's say, 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. Now, let me talk about a technical issue, which is actually at the heart of the entire problem, which is the fact that if you actually put your hands into these pieces of code, if you go to the NTEP model or the MWF model or the NCAR model, you realize that a lot of these parameterizations are very modular, and they're so modular that it's at the subroutine level. So this is a picture from Stefan de Rood, and it highlights different types of boundary layers. So this is a dry convective boundary layer with no clouds like over the desert. This is a stratocumulus top boundary layer, and this is a sort of a shallow convection puffy cumulus cloud boundary layer. And what he highlights here is the fact that each one of these different types of boundary layers is often handled by different subroutines in your code. And actually, behind them, there are fundamentally different ideas. So for things like stratocumulus top boundary layer, you use a diffusivity approach for this covariance term for the subgrid scale flux, while for shallow convection, you use more what we call a Mass-Flux, and I'll describe what that is. But this modularity is really seriously hindering our progress, and unless we have sort of more unified and integrated approaches to the entire mixing problem, we always have difficulties in doing better climate and weather prediction. So next slide is about an approach that we've developed in the last 10 years, a bunch of people, which we call Eddy-Diffusivity Mass-Flux. And the fundamental concept is very simple. The idea is that before you do the Reynolds decomposition and averaging, you divide the grid square in two regions, one region that is going up, one region that is going down. Often the updraft region, the one that's going up, is much more active than the one that's coming down. And if you do that, then your subgrid scale vertical flux is actually composed of three terms. The first term over here is really the mixing that exists within the updraft region. So AU is the area of a particular box that is occupied by the updraft. The second term is sort of the mixing that exists around the updraft, so in the environmental region. So you have 1 minus U minus AU. And finally, the last term is sort of an essential one, which is about the interaction between all these plumes, these thermals, these updrafts, and the environment around them. Now, we can do a bunch of simplifications. One of them is that the updraft area is very small. We could debate that, but we're not going to. I'm happy to answer questions. But in the end, what we do is that we approximate this entire expression by two components. One that is supposed to represent the smaller scale mixing. So there's a sort of a decomposition in smaller scale mixing and larger plumes here, right? So this is a smaller scale mixing, and this is represented by Eddy-Diffusivity. And then we use the Mass-Flux, which is nothing else than trying to represent and calculate explicitly the properties in the updraft. So to calculate the Mass-Flux, you need to calculate the area occupied by the updraft, how energetic the updraft is, and the different variables within the updraft. And this is the term that actually represents the interaction between the plumes and the environment. And one way to see why this is actually needed is to look at this picture on the right. So here we did the same thing as before. We actually do a cut, horizontal cut, in a domain like this LES domain. So imagine you do an horizontal cut in this domain. You have 1 million points, and you plot all these points. And the plot is now slightly different. This is humidity, total water, so liquid plus vapor. This is the vertical velocity, so all these points are going up, these points are going down. This is, there's no negative humidity. This is humidity minus the mean. But what you can see is two completely different domains. A domain that is full of the points that are actually around the plumes in a way. And this is sort of a very Gaussian distribution that is fundamentally, taken care by the Eddy-Diffusivity term. And then you have this sort of very skewed part of the distribution that is associated with moist convection, with very active plumes trying to penetrate the environment and having properties that go up to 4 or 5 meters per second of vertical velocity in a fairly innocent shallow convection situation. So you can clearly see that there is a decomposition here that we need to represent the two sort of types of mixing, and they are represented in the eddy-diffusivity mass-flux approach. Now, we've used the eddy-diffusivity mass-flux to do a variety of things. I'll show some results. In many of these, I'll be sort of brief and general, but we have a bunch of papers that we could send you, and I'm happy to answer questions by email as well. One of the most simpler results and easier to see the advantage of eddy-diffusivity mass-flux is when you have a dry convective boundary layer. So imagine that what you have is a situation that, the sun warms the surface like over the desert. There's no clouds, there's no condensation. These are the profiles of potential temperature. This is humidity. Don't worry too much about humidity. Just look at the potential temperature. It's a similar result. And here you have results from the large eddy simulation model, the very high resolution model, a one-dimensional just diffusivity approach, actually a good one, but still just diffusivity, and one that involves the diffusivity and the mass-flux component. And the mass-flux component is really representing the thermals that often do what people call the counter-gradient part of the mixing, and I'll get back to that. But what you can see, just look at the blue curve, what you can see is that the eddy-diffusivity mass-flux really gets a very well-mixed representation of the potential temperature. It doesn't have this unstable sort of layer that eddy-diffusivity always needs to maintain because of the way it actually tries to estimate the fluxes and try to kind of represent the counter-gradient flux, although not doing it. And so this is a good example of how eddy-diffusivity mass-flux improves the quality of the simulations, even in a very sort of theoretical manner. And of course, this has a big impact in terms of, even dry convective boundary layers are important for dispersion of pollutants, for example. Now, in terms of moist convection, the problem gets significantly more complicated. And one of the things that we found recently is that what we need to actually do is describe or parameterize the PDF of plume or updraft properties. So what we do is that we carry this PDF, and at Cloudbase, in the latest work, what we actually do is we sample the PDF to generate a variety of plumes. So this is really a Monte Carlo method. It's a stochastic method. And what it turns out to be the case is that we need this sort of stochasticity or this Monte Carlo sampling nature to this scheme to actually obtain realistic distributions of thermodynamical properties. Now, this is an important point because this is not ensemble prediction. It's really stating that even from the purely deterministic parameterization point of view, when the nonlinearities are too complex and not just a quadratic dry component like Navier-Stokes, you really do need to go often into sort of stochastic approaches. And if you do that, you end up with quite good results. I just highlight this one. You can look at Sushi et al. Papers, one in 2012 and one that come out in 2013. These are just the liquid water potential temperature profiles and total water. There's not much to see there. This is the BOMEX case, but I want you to call your attention to two variables over here. This is the updraft fraction, so the updraft, the area of the green box that is covered by the plumes, and this is the speed or the velocity, the vertical velocity of those updrafts. And we look at the LES from two perspectives, what we call two different decompositions. One is a decomposition that looks at clouds. So these are all the points that have clouds in the LES. And so this is the vertical velocity in the large eddy simulation model where all the clouds are. But then there's a sort of a more active part. We also look at what we call the core, which is regions that are cloudy but also have a positive vertical velocity or vertical velocity above a certain value or positive buoyancy. There's different definitions. But what you can clearly see is that the eddy-diffusivity mass-flux, which is this resulting here in blue, both in the updraft vertical velocity and in the updraft area are very much between these two sort of extremes, which is in principle what we should be looking for. Now, let me just spend the next 2 minutes, and that's it, talking about the dry implementation of the eddy-diffusivity mass-flux into geotest. So what we did was basically replace the vertical diffusion equation that is here in green, the reference model, which is the, has many names, but it's essentially a K-profile scheme with a counter-gradient term. We replaced this by our eddy-diffusivity mass-flux. The essential difference is that you have this mass-flux component that is actually doing the counter-gradient mixing, but is also doing a variety of other things. It's also doing top entrainment, and it's also basically creating the roots for the thermals that will become shallow convection. Now, we don't have phase transitions in our approach. This is just one example of how in single column model you actually improve the results. In the first plot, so again, it's this sort of dry convective problem. So it's just imagine over the desert getting very warm, the boundary layer gets very deep. This is potential temperature. Just look at the potential temperature for the moment. These are two different cases with different surface heat fluxes and lapse rates in the free troposphere. But the important thing here is to realize that for actually fairly active boundary layers, both the large eddy simulation, the GFS reference model, which is the one that is operational, and the Eddy-Diffusivity Mass-Flux are not too different. But when you change slightly the fluxes from 200 watts per square meter to about 100 watts per square meter, you get a fundamental difference. So the GFS reference is really too active compared to the LES, and the Eddy-Diffusivity Mass-Flux seems to follow the LES much better. So we did implement this with the help of Ryerson. We implemented this in the GFS model. There's a couple of results from about 2 months of data simulation experiments. The most relevant is the fact that the RMSE for the winds actually is reduced in a very significant manner. So in this figure, what you have is the wind RMSE at different heights. So this is 1,000 millibar, that's 10. This is forecast time, so this is day 2, day 4, day 5. This is the entire this is the control error, so this is about 9 meters per second. And here in green is the improvement. I mean, virtually everywhere at any forecast time, except just in the beginning, the new EDMF really does reduce the RMSE in a very significant manner, in particular in these regions of about half a meter per second, which is very very substantial. Now, of course, as you well know, when you implement something in weather prediction models, not everything goes according to plan, and some things are better, some things are worse. One of the things that is not better, it's actually a bit worse, is that this version of EDMF decreases the amount of cloud cover by about 4%. So there's, it's a mixed bag, although the wind errors are very good sign. So the dry EDMF, which is basically the Eddy-Diffusivity Mass-Flux without the shallow convection, moist convection, is really sort of an initial step to a fully moist implementation of the EDMF that we propose for a phase 2 of our CPT. This is our summary. I hope I guess 15 minutes. I'm doing well on time, right, Dan?
Yeah, you're great. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So this is the summary. Nothing special in the beginning. Many of you know this. We need realistic parameterizations of boundary layer turbulence and convection. There is a serious modularity problem. So the problem is not only conceptual and theoretical. This is a real practical problem. I mean, I worked at ECMWF for many years. When I left, we had at least 5 or 6 different subroutines to do different types of mixing. That hasn't changed dramatically. Well, a little bit, but not as dramatically as it should. So we need unified approaches, and unified in sort of a conceptual way, but also in the practical way. And dry convection becomes much more realistic with this combination of Eddy-Diffusivity Mass-Flux. An important point for us is that we need to have some sort of stochastic method that comes inherently from the approach that we use. So it's not something imposed because of ensemble prediction, but we need it to actually represent moist convection accurately or more realistically. And when we implement the very simple dry part into GFS, we get sort of neutral scores in general, except that we get a little bit less clouds, but we do get a substantial reduction of the wind errors everywhere in the troposphere. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Joao. So what I'm going to do is unmute the phone lines and see if we have any questions. So just bear with me for a moment. Okay. Are there any questions on the phone line for Joao?
Yeah, this is Mike Eck. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Mine's very quick. I'm Cecile Penland, and I just managed to get through in time to see your summary slide. Can I see the rest of your slides later?
Sure, and you can send me an email or you can phone me, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
Cecile,
I could send you the slides. I don't think they are necessarily publicly available, but I'm happy to send you by email.
Okay, that's fine then.
Cecile, we also put up all of the slides and recordings of the webinars on the webinar website. So if you go to the email that I sent earlier today or last week announcing the webinar, you'll be able to follow the link and get to the webinar site.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the problems.
No, not at all. No, not at all.
Thanks.
I'd like to see it too. So I should be more familiar because you're doing this at NCEP, Joao. This is Mike Eck. Just really quickly on the moist convection, you're dealing in terms of like moist conservative variables. So what just in a nutshell, where do you see that? Where do you see the next steps there?
Right, so that's an interesting point. I mean, because we do everything in moist conserved variables, and GCMs in general don't. So that's been a sort of a perennial problem. that now affects the mixing part as much as it does affect cloud parameterization. So that's a very good point. I mean, the interesting thing here is that we still, in terms of cloud parameterization and moist convection, we still so much behind in a certain sense that we're still trying to find out which thermodynamic variables we need to use. And I don't think people are aware of how deep the sort of the conceptual, I don't want to call them problems, but the conceptual conundrums are. We probably should use conserved variables. It is not easy to have that into GFS. But in our case, we have only implemented the dry EDMF, so we haven't had that problem.
Sure. So, yeah, okay. Well, we can talk more offline, but.
Sure.
Great. Okay, thanks a lot, Joao, for the excellent presentation, and thanks for the questions. Ning, are you on the line?
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. So our next speaker is Ning Zhang from University of Maryland. And Ning, what I'm going to do is transfer control of the WebEx over to your computer right now.
Okay. Do you see me now?
No, I don't. So what you want to do is click the Quick Start tab and then click the Share My Desktop button.
Okay.
Great.
Do you see me now?
Yeah, I can see your screen. So what you want to do is bring your PowerPoint slides up, make them full screen. Okay, yeah, that looks good. Okay, so whenever you're ready, go ahead, Ning.
Okay. So I guess I'll move into a totally different direction downward to land surface and vegetation carbon cycle processes. So here's the work we have done and is ongoing with Arun Kumar and Eugenia Kauna and a number of other collaborators at NASA, universities, and NOAA. So for this audience, we're probably more familiar with, when we talk about interaction between surface and atmosphere, the evaporation, sensible heat flux, energy, and water. But there are important processes, including aerosol, carbon cycle fluxes, that are a key part of the Earth system. So we will go in that direction by asking the question, can we predict ecosystem carbon cycle on seasonal and interannual timescales, given that we know now the coupled climate models have predictability on these timescales, such as INSO prediction. So why do we want to know these things? At least a number of reasons. One thing is actually atmospheric CO2, as you see in the Keeling curve, is actually a pretty good climate index, probably better than global total precipitation, I would say. And there are a lot of practical applications we want to know, for example, fire, crop harvest, ecosystem productivities. And past work has been empirical, but I think that with all the dynamical models, we have the opportunity to look into the possibility of dynamical prediction. And ultimately, in the Earth system model and analysis framework, and getting the biosphere and carbon cycle into it is a key. So this will serve as a stepping stone. There are also a bunch of other things, such as the upcoming carbon monitor and trading market. We need to know this kind of information. So I'll take a couple of slides to just give you a very quick view to lead you from the familiar mononode CO2 record to what we are looking at here. So you take the mononode CO2 record, it has this long-term increase as well as the seasonal cycle, which is very substantial. It's larger than the fossil fuel emission, the seasonal amplitude, and it's due to the northern hemisphere biosphere growth and decay over a seasonal cycle. And what we are after here is actually not these signals, but rather the interannual variability, which is very difficult to see. Look at the CO2 concentration. If you do a little massage of the data, taking the time derivative and filter out the seasonal cycle, what you're left with is this interannual variability showing at the bottom. And together with fossil fuel emissions, and the Southern Oscillation Index inverted. So the black curve is the interannual variability. It turns out it has strong correlation with N-cell. For example, the 97-98 El Nino, the terrestrial biosphere, now we know, was a major contributor, released in the anomaly sense several gigatons of carbon, such that for several months the normal carbon sink completely disappeared, so the whole surface became a carbon source. And this correlation is as high as 0.6 at a lag of 3 to 6 months. And the model development on the vegetation, dynamic vegetation global carbon cycle has been relatively slow compared to physical climate models. I would say probably 20 years behind. And however, in recent few years, the scale has really improved. Here's an example showing this particular model, Vegas, a simulated flux in black compared to the monoannual CO2. Again, it's just interannual variability signal. So it captures much of the interannual signal, but misses important events such as the Pinatubo period in early 1990s. And it's a big question the carbon cycle scientists are still trying to figure out. Here's a spatial pattern of the interannual carbon flux. And the top is this model, Vegas, and the bottom is so-called answer inversion based on observations of CO2 concentration over these triangular dots, and use a meteorologic field to invert surface fluxes. And you can see the model gets a broad pattern release of carbon over the Amazon, for example, during El Nino due to drought. And there's a very interesting conspiration theory that says how the climate anomaly coincidentally causes a tropical drought, and that links with reduced photosynthesis and increased respiration, so it leads to very large flux. There's also robust signal in mid-latitude, such as southwestern United States, where during El Nino you actually get wetter, so it actually acts as a carbon sink during those periods. So now, this set up the stage. Two major things is the significant improvement in scale in the climate forecasting system, such as CFS, which is what we're going to use, and then the development of dynamic ecosystem carbon cycle models. So we did a pilot study to do a handcuff experiment to test its feasibility. Now let me take 2 slides to introduce you quickly a key tool of this exercise, the Vegas carbon cycle model. And it does a full carbon cycle starting from photosynthesis, 60 petagram carbon per year, and half of that goes back as autotrophic respiration, the remainder as dead leaves and dying trees, and get respired as soil carbon or heterotrophic respiration. So the model is a full dynamic vegetation model. It actually predicts competition between so-called plant functional types. For example, if climate changes in this region where I am, you will probably get more broadleaf than needle-leaf trees. So there are many other things like wetland and so on. So here is a more detailed diagram of this specific model, Vegas. And while you are looking at this diagram, and let me say that this model is 12 years old, has been applied to both paleoclimate study, glacial and glacial cycles, as well as future coupled carbon climate interaction studies, which demonstrated a positive feedback due to carbon climate interaction, and has been tested on interannual timescales and long-term carbon sink. It's part of the North American Carbon Program Modeling and Comparison Project, as well as the international equivalent, the Trendy Project, which is contributing to the IPCC report right now through the Global Carbon Project. So now, this diagram basically shows the core of the forecasting system we put together We're not doing fully interactive, no vegetation albedo feedback. It's just taking the CFS 25-year hindcast experiment output, most importantly precipitation temperature, and use that to drive the carbon model. One big problem here is actually initialization. The observation, unlike atmosphere, is very limited for the biosphere. So we are not doing data assimilation whatsoever. What we're doing is we're using the ensemble average of the forecast from the previous month as the initial condition of the next month's forecast. So it's really like a very crude kind of approach at this moment, just to demonstrate the feasibility. So the whole forecast is 25 years. Every single forecast is done monthly. Every month you have a forecast, but it's multiple ensemble, and 9 months into future. So here's a sample result. 2 grid points, one at the Amazon, one at southwestern U.S. for the 97-98 El Nino period. And so look at the Amazon where you get a drought during El Nino. You see the green ensemble member forecast compared to the black line, which is a tier 2 kind of validation. And you see the ensemble nature, several members don't really get the decrease in mid-primary productivity, but more of them, probably 2/3, do get it. And then later on in 98 July, that one actually had much better agreement. And you move on to southwestern U.S., and you see a year or two increase in productivity after the El Nino actually really is robustly predicted. So the forecast actually agrees pretty well in general. There seems to be a pretty long memory. So now do another kind of analysis, anomaly correlation with lead time, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months for the 3 panels respectively. So I draw your attention to first the Amazon again. You see this pretty robust predictability, which extends 9 months into the future. It hasn't really reduced so much along the east coast of Brazil. You actually, Atlantic coast, you have this 0.6 also for quite a large area. And southwestern U.S. similarly has fairly large predictability, and that stays, lingers around for quite some time. So this scale is actually higher than the climate forcing from the CFS system itself. As you can see in this slide, the summer of scale, so it's a typical standard summer of scale plot. So you see precipitation temperature at the top. You especially look at precipitation, see how fast this scale decreases as the lead time increases from 1 to 9, while you see the NPP at the bottom right corner, it decreases much more slowly. And let me skip this one on the summer scale, which shows the spring barrier of El Nino prediction. The whole thing get delayed, but the predictability again is higher in carbon flux. So while INSA is a dominant signal, but there are other important things this system also captures. Here is the well-known, well-documented turn of this century drought and the mid-latitude. And you see North America and Eurasia, very widespread drought, and shows up in the anomaly. And the forecast is actually able to capture it 6 months in the future, quite a bit of it, for example, in the Caribbean coast of the United States and part of Central Asia. And another thing that is of great interest from an impact point of view is fire. And the Vegas model actually has a fire module that predicts fire probability and then associated with carbon flux release. Here, we're comparing a satellite-derived fire product on the top Actually, on the left, one is climatology, one is a 97 anomaly compared to Vega's model prediction on both sides. So this is not the CFX forecast one. It's just observed climate anomaly driver. Shows, for example, the Arca fire at the southern Amazon. So predicting fire is very difficult. So if we use purely model simulation, you get the seasonal variation averaged over western U.S. with 2 strong seasonal cycles compared to observation at the bottom. However, if we introduce a human factor, that is, if the fire is small, it's suppressed, but if fire large, it gets out of control, you get it. So this is a very nonlinear kind of human factor. If you kind of do a simple parameterization of that, you actually get much better agreement like this large fire in 2000 and then 2002, and suppress the smaller fires. And now move on to something we have been doing recently, is actually instead of the HUNCast, take the CFS actual operational forecast. We developed some initial tools. So this is one such experiment in 2009, but it's done afterwards, but it's using the actual forecast data. So you see, at the end of 2009, the models predict an upward increase in ecosystem flux into the atmosphere, which turned out was not supported by CO2 observation from NOAA and other stations while we were tracking it at the time. So there was this discussion in the carbon community whether that was partly caused by economic downturn, and that did. First quarter of 2009 coincident remarkably well with a decrease in global GDP. And then the El Nino effect caught up after that, and it rose again. So finally, to summarize, this HUNCast experiment suggests that ecosystem carbon cycle prediction on interannual timescale, as opposed to climate projection, long-term projection, which there has been a lot more study done by IPCC working group too. The results are encouraging, in fact, better than expected. We suspect, even though not proven, this higher than climate itself predictability had to do with memory in the hydrology, soil moisture figures out the high frequency variability in precipitation, and also in vegetation itself. And there are a number of issues that need to be addressed, and development, one of the things we identify is actually initialization. Probably require some kind of data simulation. We're exploring this possibility at this moment, and there are many other things that needs to be usually done. So that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ning. That was great. So I'd like to go to the phones or anyone in the room here to see if there are any questions.
Can I have a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ning, this Vega's model, it seems, is coupled with the CFS system, right?
It's one way for this exercise I'm showing.
Okay. Then my follow-up question is not valid at all, because I want to say, is there any feedback impact to the climate signal?
There is. We have actually a bunch of work in parallel, as well as other groups showing how vegetation albedo feedback is important, as well as evaporation feedback. For example, a famous example is the Sahel drought. Without vegetation feedback, typical model would get like only a quarter of the observed amplitude in the famous Sahel drought.
So you mentioning when they, like an ecosystem to have the two-way coupled with the climate model, it expect some signal, improvement, right, for the fully coupled case.
That's what I would argue, yeah. And there's some past studies demonstrating that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Ning, this is Jin Huang. I have a question. So your project will be ending in six months, right?
Yes.
Okay. So since this is a climate testbed project, do you envision at the end of the funding period you will have something to deliver to NCEP?
We actually have the plan to put a website. Like one of the slides I showed actually was a copy and paste from this testing website we have. So we are putting up this very kind of rudimentary kind of plots there to test right now. I would happy to explore. I would love to explore with NCEP how to do this. For example, like yeah.
That's great. Thanks for the question, Jin, and thanks for the talk, Ning. If there are any other questions for Ning, please hold them until the end of the webinar, and hopefully we'll have a chance for some more discussion. Tom, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. What I'm going to do is transfer control of the WebEx over to your computer.
Okay. Okay, can you see my desktop now?
Yes, I can. Okay, it looks good. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. So I work on the research side of NOAA, and we get a substantial part of our money through the NOAA Climate Program Office. And the sort of work that I focus on is really at the very shorter ranges of the climate timescales, out to a couple weeks' time. For forecasts of these length scales, we know that we're going to need to apply ensemble prediction systems to do these problems correctly because of the growth of chaotic errors from the initial condition. And we also know that our forecasts are going to be contaminated somewhat by model errors. Well, we also know that there are people that want reliable probabilistic forecast guidance right now, even though potentially our current generation ensemble systems can't deliver those reliable forecast products directly. So that has motivated us to explore what we could do if we had what are called reforecast data sets, retrospective forecasts, also commonly known as hindcasts. And the general idea is having a long time series of past forecasts with the same system that you run operationally. Can you use that plus the observations in the past to correct the current forecast model guidance? So that's what I'll talk about today, is a reforecast data set that we have developed, and that's applicable to the currently operational medium range ensemble prediction system at NCEP. Next slide. Okay, so here's a bit of motivation for why we think having many, many years of reforecasts could be helpful. And here in Boulder, Colorado, it's been very dry recently. Next week, it actually looks like there's a potential for a storm on the horizon. So a time series like the one I'm showing you here is perhaps realistic of what we would expect out here. And as you can see, the most recent forecast is for a very heavy precipitation event relative to the past month or month and a half of data. And one would imagine that that last month or month and a half is really not providing the information that you would need to correct for potential systematic errors in today's forecast. What you really need are other forecasts that are comparable in precipitation amount that happened at a similar time of the year. So you might have to look back a year, 2 years, maybe even 2 decades to build up a sample for a dry regime. Another possible thing that you might want to be able to do is to make some modifications to high-impact forecasts like hurricane tracks. Well, this was Hurricane Rita's official track guidance, which was largely based on the ensemble prediction systems. And those were predicting landfall just south of Houston. But is there any sort of systematic error in these track forecasts? And obviously, we don't have a lot of samples of hurricanes out in the Gulf of Mexico. They happen every couple of years. So one has to look back over a long period of time to build up enough samples to potentially evaluate whether your forecast is too far east, too far west. Another thing that you might want to be able to do if you're a researcher is to run a regional simulation of a high-impact weather forecast case. Well, if you want to run Hurricane Rita and you want to run it in a fashion that's similar to what you would be running a real-time simulation where you are not driving it with reanalysis boundary conditions but with actual forecast boundary conditions, where do you get those forecast boundary conditions from? A Reforecast can provide that. And another potential application, here I'm showing you an analyzed data. This is the change in blocking frequency, atmospheric blocking frequency, as a function of latitude under normal conditions in the green curve for the winter time, and then subsequent to a strong Indian Ocean MJO. And you can see a big change in that frequency. But you may be interested in exploring whether your forecast model has the ability to replicate those changes in frequency. And with the intersection of two uncommon phenomena, you really need a long time series to explore such questions. So again, the long retrospective forecast data sets can help. So this is some brief details on that data set. Every day at 0Z from 1984, late 1984 to current, we have generated an 11-member ensemble reforecast. And for most of the past period, it was initialized with a climate forecast system reanalysis, and it used what are called ETR, ensemble transform with rescaling perturbations, to generate the other 10 perturbed initial conditions. Some of these details have changed just within the last half year as NCEP has upgraded their operational data assimilation scheme, and we initialize from that instead of a reanalysis. We follow the same resolution as is done operationally, which is T254 or a little less than 50 kilometers in week 1, T190 or 70-ish kilometers in week 2. And we have two archives for the data, a fast archive on spinning disk, which has a lot of very commonly accessed variables, and then we have the full model states available at the Department of Energy on a tape archive. So out on our website, you can get access from 1985 through September 2012 data, and we're working to make that all the way through December 2012, and we'll have that soon available. And we have two websites, which I'll show you some examples of in just a second here. And we're also working on many experimental products, such as probabilistic precipitation graphics right now. As for data that you can get, here's a list of upper air data. You can see common mandatory levels where we have winds, temperatures, geopotential. For the lower ones, also humidity. And for potential wind wind generation applications, we also saved model levels right down near the ground. We also saved a whole bunch of variables at the original model resolution shown here, and these are things like near surface temperatures, winds, total precipitation, fluxes near the surface, things that we think people would want at high resolution, the original native resolution. If you go to our website, you can download subsets of this data. You would click on, I want total accumulated precipitation, for example, and perhaps you want it on a 1-degree grid, or maybe you wanted it on the original half-degree grid. You could click on that tab and get the original data at its resolution. Enter the dates that you desire, the range of dates, and the forecast times. And if you haven't asked for too much data, it will spit back a file at you some hours later. If you are interested in just a select day or two and you want the entire model state, the full vertical resolution data, we provide that also. You go to our portal at the Department of Energy where we generated this data set and enter the date of interest and the perturbations that you want. So let me show you now some characteristics of the raw forecasts. Now this is done over a period of 25 plus years, so as you can see here, the forecast skill is changing in time. Now, we have previously generated a reforecast with a 1998 version of the model. And when you're looking at sets of lines that have the filled-in colors, that's with that older data. And the ones with the unfilled-in lines are with our current generation reforecast data set. The heavier colored line is the northern hemisphere. The less bold line is the southern hemisphere. So, for example, looking at those red lines, the 5-day forecast that we're making for 500 geopotential is about as good as the old 3-day forecasts. Now, this is due to the significant improvements that NCEP has made in their forecast systems, in the assimilation of more observations, the higher resolution model, the development of improved parameterizations and such. And you can also see some change in the observing system as the squiggles change and somewhat increase over time to higher anomaly correlations in more recent years. And for select phenomena, like here for hurricane tracks, that statistical inhomogeneity is greater between the more recent data and the further past data. So, for example, hurricane tracks, as you can see here, the solid lines are the mean error of hurricane tracks. The dashed line is the spread in the ensemble. And looking at the mean error for 1985, it's significantly larger than it is in the period 2005 to 2010. So for statistical post-processing applications, that might introduce a complication here, that if you find an analog in the past for today's forecast from 1986, it may have a different sort of skill associated with it than today's forecast. So now let's consider some statistical post-processing here. First, this is just from a study that I did a few years ago, looking at the reliability of precipitation forecasts for a day 3 forecast and whether we're above or below 10 millimeters precipitation. This is data over the U.S. And looking at NCEP's probability forecasts, what you would hope is a diagonal line here. So with these reliability diagrams, when you're forecasting 80% probability and you look at the data after the fact, that has occurred 80% of the time, and in fact it's occurring something more like 40% of the time. So it's very unreliable here, and it has very low skill. Now this is a slightly older version of the model there, but I won't go into the details of our statistical post-processing, but this is just to show you that with the post-processing of our reforecasts using an analog technique that we developed several years back, we can effectively get almost perfect reliability in our forecasts and very significantly improve this skill. Here, the horizontal red line was the skill that I showed you for that period in 2010, and compare that now with that red curve that you see above, which is the day 3 skill from our new system. And that skill does vary with season, but you can see it's generally higher, much higher than the raw ensemble forecasts were in 2010. Now, I don't have the raw ensemble forecasts for 2012, but they're only slightly higher. The raw forecasts are still far below that red curve there. So we've really made a pretty significant improvement here with post-processing using that long time series of reforecasts. And again, going back to that second slide where I showed you that time series, when you're in a particularly dry location, having many, many decades of past forecasts can be especially helpful for finding those rare events in the past that match today's rare event and getting the conditional distribution of what actually occurred in the observations in those circumstances. Some other things that we have done, well, what could you do, for example, if, let's say, you're a wind power generator and you've recently put up a turbine, but you don't have a long time series of observations of wind for your turbine sites. So you are up in North Dakota here. The wind speeds in your forecast in the upper left-hand panel look like they're relatively calm, but you may wonder, are there systematic biases in the forecast model that maybe it just tends to have wind speeds that are climatologically too light? Well, one thing that you can do is to just compare your wind speeds to the distribution of forecast wind speeds and find out how unusual they are. And so that's what's shown in the upper right-hand panel. And it does show that in terms of the relative ranking of the wind speed today for that 120 to 240 hour period, it's generally between the 0th and the 40th percentile of its distribution. And the actual conditions that occurred, or analyzed conditions, are shown down on the bottom. So if you were, let's say, needed to take your wind turbine down for maintenance and you're looking for a calm period, then in the absence of statistical post-processing, perhaps just having that model climatology would be helpful to tell you that, hey, at least today's forecast is unusual relative to the climatology of past forecasts. I'm working with a graduate student at St. Louis University also on extended range tornado forecasting. Here's one particular outbreak and his probabilistic forecasts from that outbreak. He's using information on the vertical wind shear and instability in the form of CAPE, convective available potential energy, as predictors into a logistic regression equation here. And you can see some nice correspondence between the high probabilities and the areas where there were tornadoes, which are the dots. Dan Collins at the Climate Prediction Center is using our data to help improve the operational 6 to 10 day and week 2 forecast guidance here for both temperature on the left-hand side, precipitation on the right. And as I mentioned early on, it's nice to have the ability to go back into the past and for high impact or interesting weather cases to run regional models. And this is just a little snapshot that Tom Galarno from NCAR produced, where he drove a regional WRF model reforecast using our lateral boundary conditions and initial conditions from the GFS. And he got better intensity forecasts here. The HRDAT is the observed intensity. The ARW Hurricane WRF ramped up in intensity more quickly than did the GFS ensemble forecasts there. Another thing that we're hoping to do is to make track error corrections using the reforecasts. Here's a synthetic example. Let's say today's forecast position of a hurricane is here. We go back and we find for similar lead time, 72 hours here, past 72-hour forecasts over the 25+ years. And let's say those are the blue dots here. And let's just pretend that the observed positions were at the end of those red tails there. Well, that implies that there ought to be a shift. So we might, let's say, have a forecast track that was more like what's shown in black here, even though the forecast position was there. We make a bias correction in the track forecast based upon the discrepancies between the forecast and the analyzed positions in the past. Finally, now going back to that example that I talked about before in blocking and MJO. First, blocking. You can see the large sample size allows you to say something rather nicely quantitatively about the general frequency of blocking in your forecasts for different lead times. You can see, for example, here, for days 6 and beyond, we somewhat under forecast the incidence of blocking in the GEFS system. I showed you the top panel before. Below here on the bottom panel now is using our reforecast data, looking at that intersection of blocking and an Indian Ocean MJO. And it is indeed at least showing here now that there is a suppression of blocking frequency associated in the Atlantic sector here and in the East Pac, pretty much like it was in the analyzed data. So this is a win for the GEFS, and this is a sort of diagnosis that you wouldn't be able to do with just a year or two of past forecasts. So that data is now freely available to the community. Again, we have a fast archive and a slower tape archive of the full model state, and we're working hard on methods for statistical post-processing, and we hope others will use this data set for that and for other applications, such as understanding model errors and perhaps for doing these regional reforecasts, and maybe for many other things that we hadn't even contemplated yet. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. That was a great talk, and we have time for one quick question. I think somebody has their phone unmuted at the moment. I can hear a conversation. Anyhow, if there's a question on the line, please go ahead and ask. Well, I have a quick question, Tom. I'm wondering what inspired the work on wind energy and producing an 80-meter wind product in this project. Does this have something to do with the WFIP, or is this something else?
WFIP is really more focused right now on the very short time scales, because that's where most of the decisions for wind energy are. It's making a commitment a day out for how much power you think you can provide, and then operating your turbines based upon forecasts of hours. But we actually were funded by the Department of Energy in the sense of them giving us the supercomputer time, specifically to explore the ability to make longer lead renewable energy forecasts and potentially allow decisions for renewable energies to be made many days in advance. And there just aren't products out there right now for that sector for these longer time scales. And so that's a big part of what we hope to do with this data set. But we're at that stage where we're having created the data set, but we haven't really done much yet in the way of product generation.
Yeah, no, it really is an issue with the longer time scale forecasts, and so it's great to see that you're doing this. All right, well, if there are any other questions for Tom, feel free to hold on to them to the end of the webinar. And Tom, thanks a lot.
You're very welcome.
Melissa, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. I'm going to transfer control over to your computer. Okay, it looks good. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, great. So this is a collaborative project here at NCAR with myself and Linda Mearns, but also with UConn with Angie Seth and Jean Diabel. We're looking at examining the credibility of an ensemble of RCM simulations and their projections for warm season precipitation over the southwest, central U.S., and northeast. I'm going to focus mostly on the results for the Southwest in this talk, as it's a more complete story at this point. Our goal is to really establish the differential credibility of the RCM and the GCMs. And we're going to do this using some basic metrics, but we want to extend this beyond the use of basic metrics, get beyond just looking at biases and precipitation and temperature in these simulations, and establish whether or not the processes behind the precipitation are credibly simulated or not. We're also looking to identify the bias in these simulations and how this impacts the projections of future climate change. I'm mostly going to focus on the simulations from NARCAP. If you're not familiar with NARCAP yet, it's the North American Regional Climate Change Assessment Program. We have 6 different regional climate models, downscaling 4 different GCMs, with 12 of those combinations being simulated. The current period is 1971 through 2000, and the future is 2041 through 2070. The RCMs have also been used to dynamically downscale the NCEP DOE Reanalysis 2 product, so we have a good baseline for comparison with observations there. These simulations are from 1980 through 2004. The simulations are all done at 50 kilometers over most of North America. You can see the domain over on the right here. And there are also 2 global 50-kilometer time slices using the atmospheric component of the GFDL and also the CAM. These are the various simulations we've been doing. The climate change simulations use the A2 emission scenario. The 4 GCMs are the GFDL, the Hadley Global Climate Model, the Canadian Global Climate Model, and the Community Climate System Model from NCAR. The RCMs are the Regional Spectral Model, the Hadley Regional Model, the Regional Climate Model 3, MM5, the Canadian Regional Climate Model, and WRF. The various orange arrows are all the simulations that are planned but also completed. We have one simulation here that may or may not be completed at this point. And also, all of them are driven by NCEP. We're also looking at CMIP3 simulations, particularly the ones that are used to drive the regional models in NORCAP, and we'll also be including CMIP5A or GCMs. Eventually, I don't have any of that in this talk at the moment, though. For comparison, I've used a variety of different reanalyses and observationally based data sets. Nothing perfectly fits our needs, especially in the Southwest at this point. They have to have a high enough resolution and have to span the time frame of the simulations and have the variables we need. So we have the North American Regional Reanalysis, University of Delaware gridded observation data set, 1 season worth of observations from the North American monsoon experiment, TRIM precipitation, and also the 20th century reanalysis, which is 2 cores for the RCMs for comparison, but is good for comparison with the GCMs. I have here now monsoon season, so June through September, average precipitation from our NCEP-driven simulations, all 6 of them, plus the UDEL precipitation. And what the precipitation in this region, if you're not that familiar with the North American monsoon, is highly tied to the terrain during the season. We have a precipitation maximum here in Arizona along the Mogollon Rim, and also spanning through Mexico along the Sierra Madre Occidental. And you can see that the models, the regional models, do a mixed job handling this precipitation pattern. All of them get the precipitation maximum along the Sierra Madres. Some are a little too strong, like the Reg CM3, others a little too weak. 2 of the models are kind of noisy. That's just the way their precipitation works, as it turns out. I'm not exactly sure why that is at this point. The biggest problem most of these models have when they're driven by the reanalysis is not being able to capture the precipitation in Arizona and New Mexico, and then if you're to look beyond the core monsoon region, and the rest of the Southwest, Colorado, and into the plains, it's a little too dry. Some of what is going on here might be due to the resolution of the models. It's still only 50 kilometers, which is much better than the GCMs, and while it does have the terrain features, 50 kilometers isn't really enough to resolve the convective processes that are going on in the monsoon system. Some of this also seems to be due to the ability of the models to properly generate the onshore monsoon flow that is seen during the season. This is monsoon season near-surface moisture flux from these simulations. And what we're looking for, and this is NAR over here on the right, what we're looking for is onshore flow into Mexico and into Arizona. Now, NAR does have this unique problem in that its wind flow over the Gulf of California is really way too strong, but you just have to keep that in mind when looking at this. I've been looking at other reanalyses to see if one of them will be better. I do have comparisons between NAR and the NAME observations that do show me that NAR is too strong. In reality, wind should probably look a little more like what we have here in the WRF, with a nice lighter onshore flow into Arizona and also into Mexico. The models that were the driest when driven with the reanalysis are the ones that don't develop enough of this northward flow component into Arizona, like the ECP2, or the regional spectral model here, and the MM5. Another good question is, do they have a monsoon signal in their precipitation field? This is a 5-day average precipitation climatology from these simulations, and NAR and TRIM as well, and NAR compared to TRIM as well, but turns out NAR verifies fairly well over this region, and this is averaged over this full area shown in this slide. NAR is the heavy black line, and you can see that it really does have a strong monsoon signal, and the model spread around it is fairly large, but all of them at least have this signal as well. The MM5 is probably the worst of the bunch here with the pink line, but it still at least shows a monsoon signal. And I'm emphasizing this monsoon signal in the precipitation because as soon as we start driving these regional models with the global models, the the quality of the simulation varies much more heavily, shall we say. And I'm not going to make you stare at this slide for too much longer. It'll give you a headache, probably, because all of these simulations and the quality of the simulations parses out quite well by the driving GCM. Have here the same time series, same black line in all of these plots from the NAR. You can see from the Canadian global model driven runs that the monsoon signal is fairly weak. In the WRF simulation here, it is the weakest. And the other two do okay, but they're a little too dry, and the RegCM3 simulation falls off a lot about mid-season. The CCSM-driven simulations, these colored lines here down underneath the heavy black line, could give a new meaning to the phrase monsoon failure, if you'd like. The time slice, on the other hand, the CAM time slice, which is only driven with observed SSTs, does a much better job at simulating the monsoon season. The problem in these two simulations is similar, and I'm not going to show all the slides to explain this, but it basically comes down to the fact that the GCMs don't have enough atmospheric moisture content in them. And in this region, we're very close to the southern boundary, so it is getting a boundary condition every 6 hours that is much drier than it should be, and it doesn't have enough space over the water to spin up some of that moisture to try to compensate for that problem itself. There are some issues also related to the SSTs in the Gulf of California that are important here. The CCSM is exacerbating the problem with the atmospheric moisture content much more than the GCM-driven runs, which is why those simulations are so much worse than the others. If we look at the GFDL-driven runs now at the top, they have an interesting problem that isn't exactly during monsoon season, but it completely masks out what is going on during monsoon season, and that it has way too much precipitation post-season, mostly over water in this area, but also over land. Some of them do have, maybe there's a monsoon signal in there, maybe there's not. The GFDL time slice, again, only driven with the observed SSTs for this current period, does a much better job simulating the monsoon season precipitation. The best set of simulations are those driven by the Hadley Global Climate Model. We have a bit of an early onset here, but compared to the problems in the other two simulations, this isn't nearly as big of an error. These problems are not necessarily in the global models. Sorry, I forgot. I wanted to mention what was going on in that GFDL-driven run here. This is a failure of the ITCC to retreat after the monsoon season is over. It's still producing way too much precipitation, too far north. It's creating an anomalous low-pressure system that is then showing up in the RCMs and creating lots of extra rising moisture and moisture flux into this region. Instead of having monsoon season end, it just continues en masse. The GCMs don't have the same error. You can see that they all have at least a monsoon signal, if not completely covered up like the GFDL simulation here. It has the same error. The CGCM may be too dry in its atmospheric moisture content, but it's still precipitating okay in the global model. The regional model just doesn't know what to do with that problem. And we have a problem that's pretty common in a lot of GCMs here, early onset of the monsoon because the ITC propagates northward too quickly in the season. And then in some of them, like the CCSM and the CCSM-driven runs, too much winter season precipitation as well. Now, the big question, I guess, is what does this do to the projection precipitation? How credible are they? How much do you trust these simulations now? This is the ensemble mean climate change from the 13 simulations we have, the RCMs plus the 2 time slices. The top, that's temperature change. At the bottom, precipitation change. There's also a measure of agreement on here and also statistical significance. The areas that are hatched are significant, and the models also agree, more than 75% of the models agree on the sign of change. That would be 10 or more models. There's not much hatching, but to give you a sense of how well they agree otherwise, that's what this vertical scale is on the color bar here. The more intense the color, the more they agree. And you can see that there is still pretty good agreement on drying over the monsoon region, including Mexico and Arizona. But I've just showed you all these simulations that don't necessarily have a monsoon or have some serious problems. And where this drying is mostly coming from in these simulations, or the drying in terms of precipitation decrease, only is from the simulations that are verifying the worst. I have the percent change in precipitation and also the absolute change in precipitation from the ensemble mean, and the various global model-driven simulations averaged together. And you can see that the greatest change is coming out of the CCSM-driven simulations and the Canadian global model-driven simulations. And this is also the greatest change in the sense of absolute change. It just shows up really well as percent change because your precipitation is too low to begin with, or almost non-existent in the case of the CCSM-driven simulations. This also seems to be impacting other variables too, like the intensity of precipitation or the number of dry days. The decrease in intensity and the decrease in the number of wet days, or an increase in number of wet days, is also much higher in these two simulations as well. And at the bottom here, I have the change in the frequency of 3-hourly precipitation events, events in terms of it raining at a grid cell during that 3-hour period at some intensity in this region. From the various RCMs in each column, you get the different distribution in each simulation, and this is done by percentile. So this, say the second green bar here would be events that are at the 40th percentile to the 50th percentile. And while you can see there's, in the CCSM and CGCM driven runs, this decrease in the frequency of almost every type of precipitation event is much stronger in these two sets of simulations, whereas in all the rest it's much weaker, less significant in some cases where there aren't the little black boxes below a bar. That means it's not a significant change. Most of the significant changes in the other simulations are sometimes at higher percentiles, sometimes like in the Hadley Center-driven simulations across the entire distribution. So perhaps there'll be less of an increase or less of a decrease in precipitation than we get the sense there is from the entire ensemble mean. This doesn't mean this area won't dry more. I haven't looked into evaporation and such yet, and some of the drivers behind these changes in the various regional models and global models yet. I wanted to give a very brief example for the Northeast that we're working on. This work is more in progress than the work in the Southwest. We're seeing some similar issues here. In the upper right here, we have observed precipitation in the black line. It's an annual cycle, and also precipitation from the 4 NARCAP GCMs and 2 of the time slices. And you can see here, for example, the Hadley global model run has a very high bias in precipitation. This is mainly occurring in July, and it's also producing a very significant increase in precipitation in the future, which is what this plot over here shows. But if we look at moisture convergence in this region, this black box, you can see that the Hadley global model actually has too much moisture convergence by quite a bit. In this bottom plot, this shows the interannual variability of the vertically integrated moisture divergence. Convergence is highlighted in the light blue shade, and you can see that the Hadley model is producing too much convergence by quite a bit all year in these simulations. And this is one of the drivers for the NARCAP regional models in this region, and this error may or may not actually be inherited by the RCM simulations. That's something we'll be looking at in the future. So I think I'll end there. You can read my final comments on the screen, but I want to give some time for a question or two.
Great, thanks a lot, Melissa. I'm going to unmute the phone lines, and are there any questions on the phone? Okay, well, if there are no questions, if anybody has anything they'd like to ask Melissa later, just hold on to your question until the end of the webinar, and we might have a couple minutes. So thanks a lot, Melissa. Our next speaker is Xiaoqing Zhang from NOAA GFDL. Xiaoqing, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to transfer control over your computer. Okay, Xiaoqing, so go to the quick start. Okay, great.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Dan, for organizing this conference. This afternoon, I want to talk about how to use observational information to constrain the model bias. The model bias is a very fundamental problem in the climate analysis and prediction field. The model bias to the climate prediction and analysis, just like somehow like the cancer to the human body's health, they share some common points. First of all, they are both destructive. Second of all, we don't exactly understand how it happens. So we set up this project a couple of years ago. This is a collaborative project with Wisconsin University. So there's a bunch of GFDL scientists and a Wisconsin professor and a few visitors involved. So I want to follow this outline to finish today's talk. First of all, I want to give some parameter error and model bias analysis. Then I want to show you what is the most important point in the couple model parameter estimation, which is we have to use observation constraint model state first. Third point is I want to show you some importance to how to enhance the signal to noise ratio when we do the couple model parameter estimation. I want to show you if we allow the model parameter varying geographically, we can significantly increase the signals. Then I want to show you some preliminary results on the GFDL climate model. Then I will summarize. So here, these non-panels is the get from the Yusong's climate dynamics papers. It shows we use historical observation, ocean observation, and atmosphere observations. We can construct the ocean's heat content pretty well. Here, red is the analysis heat content in the top 300 meters. The black or green, this is the observation. 3 observations data set shows some uncertainty. We can see the reconstruction heat content follow the observation, well, pretty good, besides some well, has some departures. Then we do the decadal prediction. The right panel shows you some examples. This is started from 1980 January. Each 5 years, we launch a forecast. So each color line shows the Atlantic Meridional overturning index, the prediction. You can see, no matter we started from what initial condition, initial state, the model will drift away. So let's take a look at the model structure to see, outline to see how the model bias is source. First of all, we can see there is a dynamic core misfitting in the model. Then there's some physical scheme misfitting, right? Then given those, we have a lot of model primate in the model. The primate is not, accurate. The primate errors is contributed to the model bias too. So, but in these 3 categories, only model primate error there's a value, so we can use observation to tune the primate values. Then the parameter estimation theory is come along with the data assimilation theory, which is basically if we write the numerical model as a stochastic dynamic equation, then we can use a base rule to do the data assimilation to estimate, given the observations distribution, we can estimate both model state and the primate, the probability distributions. Usually we use a linear regression method to trying to project observational increment in here delta y naught to the primate. Then in here we can say because the primate doesn't have any observation and the dynamic equation, so the totaling rely on this background projection linear regression coefficient, which is determined by the model state. So if the model state has departure from observation too much, then this coefficient cannot be, correct to project the observational information to the primate. So we design an algorithm which is called the enhanced parameter correction algorithm, which is we not like traditionally people at the same time to just model state and the primate. What we do here is we let the observation to constrain the model for a while. Let the model state is converge to the observation enough. Then we use that model state to do the parameter estimation. So right panel here shows we call the equilibrium analysis. This is important for to extract the signal, project the signal to the parameter estimation. So we compare two cases in here. Use this simple couple model, which is use Lorentz 63 as a stochastic atmosphere, and there's a slow varying upper oceans, which here is represented by W. Then we coupled use C2 and C1 interaction between X2 and W, so that this is a simple couple model. Then this here simple experiment is we take the primate kappa default value as 28 as the truth model to create the observations. Then use X1's observation to estimate the kappa. If without to constrain the model state, enough, then the kappa's estimations diverge. Here is a green line. This represents the 20 members ensemble. But if we let the observation to constrain the model state up to the model comes down to equilibrium, then we do primate estimation. You can see the primate kappa is converged to the truth value 28 pretty well. That's the one part about the algorithm design. The second part I want to show you is from the two papers the visitor, Dr. Wu, working here for a couple of years in the dynamics, climate dynamics and the mountain weather review, which we're trying to detect if we allow the traditionally global uniform parameter value to vary geographically. Because, first of all, the sensitivity, model sensitivity to parameter has a geographic dependent. Second of all, the observing system itself has geographic dependent. So let the parameter being estimated varying with geographically varying is very important to extract the observation information. In order to detect the geographic variant parameter estimation problem, we have to have the model which is have the distribution, right? So first, I will show you here is the intermediate couple model, which is constructed by the barotropic vorticity advection equation. as an absolute phase component. Then has a land temperature evolution equation like this. Ocean has the ocean stream function and the sea surface temperature equation. So these three components, the coupling together by those coupling coefficients. Then I want to show you, use this slide, compare if we follow the traditional method to let the model primate has global uniform value, and let the primate has geographic independent variation. How these two schemes to give us improve the estimation quality. So the right upper panel shows we compare green line to red line to green line. Red line is a single value primate case. The green line is the geographic dependent primate optimization case. So for simply we call it red line as SPE, means single value primate estimation. The green line as GPO, means graphically dependent primate optimization. We can say the globally RMSE is significantly reduced. This is for the T0, this is sea surface temperature. The left column lists the experiment. Basically, we use sea surface temperature observation to estimate the sea surface temperature's damping coefficient Kp. Then we verify the sea surface temperature's errors. The right bottom 4 panels shows the errors distribution. We can say GPO case is much smaller than the SPE case. This slide I want to show you, we do a very interesting experiment is, down the North Pacific, we take a square, take the data out. So we want to examine if with some data sparse area, the SEO experiment and GPO experiment, how they make the different quality. We can see the top 4 panels compare the GPO is right, left button panel. SPE is left button. SPE is right middle panel. We can see the GPO's error is much smaller than the SPE case. This is also for the sea surface temperature too. Then we zoom out this data sparse area. We can see the SEO to estimate the error as, let me see, like 20 degrees. The SPE comes down to 2 degrees. Then GPO comes down to 0.2 degrees. So GPO can significantly reduce the sea surface temperature error. This slide, I want to show you some preliminary results for the GFDL's climate model. This is a twin experiment. So we take the LC transfer coefficient as the primate being estimated. The upper panel show you the estimate values. We define the signal to noise ratio, use this formula. So the big value, the larger value means the primate got more accurate. Compared to the sensitivity distribution, we can say the primate estimation result has some sort of corresponding distribution with the sensitivity, but it's not exactly location related. But we can say the overall distribution has some similar. Then we check the the ocean temperatures analysis quality. Here, green line is the black line is traditional data dissemination. The green line is SPE. The red line is GPO. So we can say the new scheme GPO especially can reduce the error below 500 meters. This shows some clue. When we optimize the primate, we can get the low frequency part, more accurate. But in the surface, the improvement is not that significant. So we have a lot of things we needed to check. But this really shows some promising results. So let me give you some summary in here. So model-driven indicator climate prediction can be relaxed by optimizing the couple model parameters use observations. Enhance the signal-to-noise ratio of stated primate covariance and eliminating the noise in the observation system is the key for successful couple model parameter estimation. Then we got two parts to showing here. One is we designed the new algorithm to increase the signal-to-noise ratio. Another is we're trying to let the primate vary geographically to reflect the model sensitivity distribution and the observing system's quality has the geographic distribution. That can increase the signal-to-noise ratio. Then apply those to the GFDO couple model. The preliminary twin experiment shows some promising results, but further examination is required to understand the impact of GPO on climate analysis and prediction. Further study are required for some coupling primate estimation. For example, use oceans observation to estimate atmosphere primate, or use atmosphere observation to estimate ocean primate. Such field needed to be more explored. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Xiaoqing. I'm going to go to the phone line and see if there are any questions. Does anybody have a question for Xiaoqing?
Yes, actually I do, please. If you're doing your geographically dependent parameter estimation,
optimization.
Yes, right. Do you have any way of making sure that the physical mechanisms are being respected? For example, if you have the air-sea interaction coefficient for SST, and you have two regions widely separated, but the physics is the same, that are both dominated by evaporation, do you get the same alpha?
This is a good question. Actually, in the primate estimation field, we estimate or say optimize the primate based on the sensitivity information, right? But the sensitivity information is not unique. So in other words, the primate estimation results is not a unique solution. But we just target it as the state error reduction. In this case, I show a lot of sea surface temperature error reduction, right? That's the purpose. We want to get more accurate state estimation. But it doesn't mean you estimate, say, primate when it's only solution. So there is some error transfer between the primate and the state. We just statistically rely on the sensitivity information.
So I guess another way of asking my question is, how do you keep from overfitting?
That's why I mentioned the signal-to-noise ratio many times. So this is people struggling with in here. When we importing the observation information to the model state or model primate, When we get the signal, put in signal, at the same time we put in the noise too. So the whole story is we have to figure out some way to check the signal to noise ratio is pretty high.
Okay.
Thanks for the question, Cecile. Are there any other questions on the phone? Any questions for any or all of the speakers?
Ning, can I call you about a question later?
It looks like Ning might have logged off of the webinar, so you might want to send him an email. Yeah.
I'll do that then. Okay, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank all the speakers. This was a really diverse set of talks and topics. So thanks for logging on today and speaking, and thanks to everyone for attending. Our next webinar is going to be on January 15th on the topic of extratropical climate extremes. We're also going to have another webinar later in the year, later in 2013, on tropical climate extremes, which is more along the lines of tropical cyclones, et cetera. And we have 4 speakers next time. Sankey Lee from the Cooperative Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Studies at University of Miami, Grant Brandstater from NCAR, Rong Fu from University of Texas at Austin, and Brian Colley from Stony Brook University. We normally have these webinars on the second Tuesday of the month, but January has the AMS meeting that week, so it's going to be the third Tuesday for those of you who keep track of the webinars in that manner. So that's January the 15th. So thanks again for joining, and I will talk to you next month.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.